Good evening. I got a couple of announcements. If you didn't see it on the Facebook page, um, our website is down right now. We're currently transitioning to the new website, and so it just needed to be taken down. It'll probably be a couple of days before I can get the new one up, but it's ready to go. So in the next few days when we get together, I'll be making announcements about that because it's going to look a lot different than what you're used to. What we've got now is not a passive advertisement for the church. It's not just a picture of the church and some words. This is an active website with stuff that will be updated at the very least on a weekly basis. Announcements will be put on there. There'll be a calendar for events. Your directory will be on there. Everyone will have their own username and password account because some of the stuff will not be accessible to the public, like the directory. The public won't be able to see the directory, okay? So when it comes up, if you notice that you don't have a profile or I have neglected to get you onto the directory, all you have to do is make sure that I know so that I can get you added on there. So that is something for you to look forward to. Hopefully this is just another way for us to work on maintaining and improving our communication as a church, because most of the announcements that the elders get up and speak on Sunday morning, most of those will be plastered right there on the front page of our website so that no one can say, well, I didn't remember that was announced. Well, you can access it 24/7 now. So hopefully that kind of helps us come together a little bit better on our goals here in the future. So this evening, we're going to be going back to our studies in Genesis. We took a little bit of a break from that just to kind of give myself a break and as well as give you guys a break. But we're going to be going back to Genesis. So if you've got your Bibles, I invite you to turn to chapter 30. This chapter is I think it's the only one that I remember off the top of my head of somebody doing combat by who can have the most kids. But essentially we're looking at a competition between two women on who can have the most kids quickest. So if you remember from several weeks ago, we're in the story of Jacob. Okay, so this is right after he's worked for 14 years for his uncle. He's now got two wives, one of which he never really wanted but got tricked into marrying. And so this is a continuation of their story. So in verse 1, the scriptures say, when Rachel saw that she bore Jacob no children, she envied her sister. She said to Jacob, give me children or I shall die. Jacob's anger was kindled against Rachel, and he said, am I in the place of God who has withheld from you the fruit of the womb? Then she said, here is my servant Bilhah. Go into her so that she may give birth on my behalf, that even I may have children through her. So, initially, the story's already sounding pretty familiar, right? Remember just a little while back in the story, Sarah giving Hagar to Abraham, and we know that turned out wonderful for everyone involved. But this is basically the same situation, right? She's not having children, she's impatient, so she's going to provide her husband with a concubine to provide a child on her behalf. But I do want to point out this accusation that he makes against her and that she makes against him. Only because, for my part, I had to read it a couple of times to figure out what was actually going on. Maybe you guys aren't quite that dense and don't need that, but we're going to go over it anyways. So Rachel, after being super jealous that her sister has had children, basically goes to her husband and says, "You need to give me children or I'm going to die." Now, she didn't say it in that way, but this is essentially what she's saying, right? And at first glance, that's just the words of an angry, upset person. But looking at it, it's not really that uncommon for us to blame one another for things that have nothing to do with us, is it? That's essentially what Jacob calls her to task for. He says, "Am I in the place of God? God's the one that hasn't given you a child. Don't blame me for this." How often do we do that? Do we pin blame and responsibility on each other? "I didn't hear you correctly, so it's your fault because you didn't explain it well enough. I didn't feel like doing this, it's your fault for not having motivated me properly. I don't feel like coming to church when we have an event, it's your fault for not having events I want to come to." And there's less facetious examples that we can come up with. I'm sure each of you know some of your own. But it's actually a very common thing for us to find in our world, this idea of, I'm going to hold you responsible for something even though it has absolutely nothing to do with you. We know it couldn't have had anything to do with Jacob because it can't be his problem. He's doing just fine getting the other one pregnant, and that's not even the one he likes. But yet it's his fault. Because God forbid it could possibly be mine. Right? Do we have those thoughts sometimes? Can you guys sympathize with the position she's in? Now, to be fair, it is always tough for any woman who is struggling with barrenness or difficulties with childbearing and all of these things. I understand it's difficult for any woman of any time period who deals with that. It's especially difficult in a time period where that relates directly to the value you have to a family. Now, that's not really how we see women in our society anymore, but it's still a very difficult topic. And before we go any further, this is not going to be one of those lessons where I try to sit here and pretend like I have some kind of answer to barrenness, but I will point out that it's understandable for why she's so upset. But we have to remember that in our anger, when we get upset, we have to be careful to make sure that the blame goes where it belongs. That we're not taking the people that are closest, most loving to us, and holding them responsible for things they have nothing to do with. Now, we'll continue on this idea of shortly after this idea of giving Bilhah, her maid, basically, to him to have children for on her behalf. Verse 5 says, "Bilhah conceived and bore Jacob a son. Then Rachel said, 'God has judged me, and has also heard my voice and given me a son.' Therefore she called his name Dan. Rachel's servant Bilhah conceived again and bore Jacob a second son. Then Rachel said, 'With mighty wrestlings I have wrestled with my sister and have prevailed.' So she called his name Naphtali." Now, to start with, we can already see that we're beginning the tribes of Israel, right? We're already getting into the finalized tribes of Israel. But isn't it interesting? She's actually naming her children based on the fact that she's in conflict with her sister. I mean, how unimportant do you have to be as a child that your value is only whether I can one-up my sibling? I don't know. I'd speak to sibling rivalries, but I don't really understand them all that well. But this is actually going to continue, and it's going to be reciprocated here in verse 9. Leah's going to decide that she's she can't let this happen. She can't be bested. So it says, when Leah saw that she had ceased bearing children, she took her servant, Zilpah, and gave her to Jacob as a wife. Then Leah's servant Zilpah bore Jacob a son. And Leah said, good fortune has come. So she called his name Gad. Leah's servant Zilpah bore Jacob a second son. And Leah said, happy am I, for women have called me happy. So she called his name Asher. Now I want to address something, because there is going to be two different responses to the story we're reading. Okay? So at this point, Jacob is effectively responsible for sleeping with 4 women, at least on a sub-regular basis. There is going to be the people who respond with, well, he's a guy. This is exactly what he wants. And then there's men who are going to look at this and say, that sounds exhausting. Now, understand this. There is a societal expectation of gender normality. Okay, what I mean by that, this isn't some, new generation thinking. This is just big words. It simply means society expects certain thoughts and behaviors from certain genders. And one of those is misogyny. The world expects that from men. The world expects a man to look at this story and think of Jacob as lucky. But most men are going to look at this story and feel sorry for the guy. And the men who don't feel sorry for him are foolish and don't know what they're talking about. Jacob is not in a place of favor right now. There's nothing favorable about living in a household where all the women in the household are at odds with each other. So we'll keep going, but this contest is just going to keep going and going and going. It actually pervades every single aspect of their lives. In verse 14, it says, in the days of wheat harvest, Reuben went out and found mandrakes in the field, Reuben being one of the sons, right? And brought them to his mother Leah. Then Rachel said to Leah, please give me some of your son's mandrakes. But she said to her, is it a small matter that you've taken away my husband? Would you take away my son's mandrakes also? Rachel said, then he may lie with you tonight in exchange for your son's mandrakes. So now we have Jacob getting pimped out by his own wife, right? She is sold. Well, one was kind of a customer, so I don't know. This has gone so far that a woman is going to sell her right to lay with her husband for what amounts to a couple of herbs. Now, mandrake, for those of you who are interested, and some of you don't care, in which case that's fine, it doesn't impact anything. But mandrakes are an herb that's traditionally used for fertility, okay, which would explain why it's pivotal in this story and why Rachel wants them so badly. But you really can't get any further in this story without understanding that Jacob is in a terrible position. At some point, he's either going to have to end this or he's going to have to answer for it. Now, what I mean by that is Jacob at fault for this contest between Leah and Rachel? Not really. I mean, he's barely even been mentioned in the story so far. I mean, once you get past the fact that he, in fact, decided to marry 2 women, but outside of that, he really has no direct responsibility in this conflict. Yet, at some point, he's going to have to answer for the division that's in his house. Men, there are a lot of times when things are going on, and maybe even like we originally talked about, we're getting blamed for something that has absolutely nothing to do with us. And it's good to understand when it has absolutely nothing to do with you. But sometimes just because you didn't cause the problem doesn't mean you don't have an expectation to resolve the problem. So this conflict that we're seeing is going to come to a head here pretty soon. Leah went out to meet him, being Jacob, and said, "You must come in to me, for I have hired you with my son's mandrakes." How loving. Like that, I'm going to tell you, that's what I want to hear from my wife. I want come to bed with me. You owe me. I have purchased this evening from you. So Jacob does so because God expects us to fulfill our responsibilities to one another. So regardless of why she feels entitled, he has a responsibility. It says, so he lay with her that night, and God listened to Leah, and she conceived and bore Jacob a fifth son. Leah said, "God has given me my wages because I gave my servant to my husband." So she called his name Issachar. So I want to address something that's not really the main point of this, but is an important point nonetheless for us to address. Is this story a story of righteousness? It's okay to answer, guys.
No.
All right. Can anyone point out a sin in the story as we've read it so far?
Jealousy.
Yeah, keep going.
Lust. Anger at God.
Sure.
If you want.
Adultery on every level, right? Not only is Jacob guilty for marrying two women, but the women then sell their help to him as concubines, and he lays with them. There's actually, we don't read into this, but there's 4 women in this conflict. 2 of them are just stuck in the middle. But this story is a story of 2 women living a life of disunity and conflict, and therefore sin. I don't think there's any way around that point. Does God bless them?
With children, yes.
Sure. It says, verse 17, and God listened to Leah, and she conceived and bore Jacob a fifth son. So, when people are doing bad things, God can still continue to bless them, right? Why would he do that?
Because he loves us in spite of ourselves.
Okay. Why would he do that specifically in this story? Why bless her with yet another child when this entire story is really wicked?
I think it was part of his plan. 12 children, 12
Sure. He's got a plan for where the world will go. Is he responsible for this conflict? No. This came about because of the choices of man and the results of their decisions. This came about because of Jacob. This came about because of Jacob's uncle. This came about because of the jealousy of these women. This came about because of the willingness of their maids, because these servants could have said no and left. I mean, they wouldn't have probably been kept, but they could have said no. So, really, when we look at this, we understand that God has this big overarching plan, and even though he's not responsible for the decisions that these people have made and the wickedness in the story, he continues to bless them because his plan is ultimately the important thing. Will we automatically know? Go ahead.
If these women had reacted differently towards each other and towards Jacob, God's plan still would have happened as he wanted it to happen.
Sure. And that's why when we read into stories like this, there's often this message of having faith. If you act in faith, God's going to take care of it. And only when we deviate from God's instruction to us and live according to our own trust do we see stories like this and the strife that they bring about. But one more question about this segment. Will we know why God blesses us? If God chooses to bless you, are you going to know why he chose to bless you?
Not necessarily.
Does Leah?
No.
No. What does she say about it?
Oh, just make my husband love me.
She gave me, God has given me my wages. Understand, wages, what I am owed, wages, because I gave my servant to my husband. Her statement has said, since I have forged adultery by giving another woman to lay with my husband, God has given me what I'm owed by giving me a child. At this point, she's denied it's even really a blessing. So, a couple of things. A, good things will happen to people who are doing the wrong thing. 2, we don't know why good things happen to people who do the wrong thing. 3, the only way for us to eventually see why God allowed good things to happen to people who are doing the wrong thing is to trust that God has a plan and that plan is ultimately more important than that person doing the wrong thing's understanding of the good thing. Does everyone follow what I just said there? All right, let's continue on. And Leah conceived again, and she bore Jacob a sixth son. I would like to mention most stories where they give concubines to their husband is because they're barren. They're not even barren. He's producing children with 4 different women.
Well, so far he's only produced with 3 of them. Rachel hasn't had any children.
You're correct. But we do know that he is at some point sleeping with her because of the next few verses. So you are correct. So far 3 women have borne children. But he's sleeping with 4. So thank you for correcting me. So this isn't even about barrenness anymore. This is just competition. Leah has no reason to give her servant to Jacob. She's doing quite well. She only does it because God forbid my sister have more children than me.
And notice that Jacob immediately rejected.
No one's claiming Jacob is the pinnacle of wisdom in this story, Sam. So, Leah conceived again. She bore Jacob a 6th son. Then Leah said, God has endowed me with good endowment. Now my husband will honor me because I have borne him 6 sons. So she called his name Zebulun. Zebulun. Yeah. Afterwards she bore a daughter and called her named Dinah. Then God remembered Rachel and God listened to her and opened her womb. So after all of this, now Rachel's going to start conceiving of her own children. She conceived and bore a son and said, God has taken away my reproach. And she called his name Joseph, saying, may the Lord add to me another son. Now, I don't know about you guys. As a man, we're told over and over, you're the provider, you're the provider. Not that we have to be the main breadwinner, but we're the provider, which means you're responsible for making sure your family is fed, clothed, and housed. You think Jacob's feeling the pressure of that yet? He's got what is this? This is, 11 children now.
I think it's 10 or 11 right now.
I'm pretty sure this is the 11th because he has 12 sons.
Yeah.
But we've talked about a daughter, so I think we're on 11. So 11 children. He's got at least 2 concubines who, let's be honest, you can't treat them like every other servant anymore. And you've got 2 wives. At some point, even a fool can see the foolishness of this plan and where it's headed. But God intends for his plan to happen regardless of how stupid the players are. Okay? So God is actually going to continue going. He's actually going to make sure that Jacob doesn't have a problem with this. So 25, it says, as soon as Rachel had borne Joseph, Jacob said to Laban, send me away that I may go to my own home and country. Give me my wives and my children for whom I have served you, that I may go, for you know the service, that I have given you. But Laban said to him, if I have found favor in your sight, I have learned by divination that the Lord has blessed me because of you. Name your wages and I will give it. Who has something in their Bibles other than divination here? Okay. Some of the older translations, some of the alternative translations will use the word experience. But in the Hebrew, it's divination. This is verse 27 when he says, if I have found favor in your sight, I have learned by divination. Some translations will use the word experience there. Yeah. But we do know that the Hebrew word is much closer to divination. Not that experience is an incorrect translation, but it's not intended the way we would use the word experience. Sure. Yeah. Yeah, no, you're exactly right. Matthew does a great job of depicting Jesus as he explains this idea that we shouldn't really the message that he's giving is when you see somebody being blessed, you shouldn't automatically assume that they're doing favorable things. That's the message that Jesus is trying to give in that verse that you brought up. Just because good things are happening to them doesn't mean they're doing good things. And just because bad things happen to you doesn't mean you're doing bad things. The fact is, good things and bad things happen because we live in a world separate from God, and it allows bad things to happen. And it allows bad people to exist. The minute we are no longer separated from God, bad people can no longer exist amongst us, and good things won't happen to the bad people. So you're right. That's a great verse to bring up. I appreciate you bringing that up. If we're going to continue in verse 28, he says, name your wages and I will give it. That's a pretty big blank check he's just written, right? The Jacob, and this is really kind of an admiration of Jacob and his intention to make sure that Laban can never, I'm convinced he does what he's about to do because he doesn't want Laban to ever be able to accuse him of being greedy or taking more than he was worth.
Well, I don't think Laban ever had any intention of paying no matter what he put.
We could argue that definitely because of hindsight and because, he's already proven that that's in his character, right? I think the only reason he agreed to this is because he doesn't actually ask for much. I mean, really, the wages he's about to ask for very, very minuscule, considering he's worked over 14 years for the guy. But he says, Jacob, in 29, it says, Jacob said to him, you have little before I came, and it has increased abundantly, and the Lord has blessed you wherever I turned. But now when shall I provide for my own household also? He said, what shall I give you? Jacob said, you shall not give me anything. If you will do this for me, I will again pasture your flock and keep it. Let me pass through all your flock today, removing from it every speckled and spotted sheep and every black lamb, and the spotted and speckled among the goats, and they shall be my wages. So my honesty will answer for me later when you come to look into my wages with you. Every one that is not speckled and spotted among the goats and black among the lambs, if found with me, shall be counted stolen. Laban said, good, let it be as you have said. But that day Laban removed the male goats that were striped and spotted, and all the female goats that were speckled and spotted, every one that had white on it, and every lamb that was black, and put them in the charge of his sons. And he set a distance of 3 days' journey between himself and Jacob. Jacob pastured the rest of Laban's flock. So what's happened here is Jacob has essentially said, let me take the least valuable of your livestock. Now, I understand the whole, tabernacle, instruction of things had to be spotless. That hasn't been given. But even in peripheral societies of this time, all white, all black, they're much more valuable than ones with markings on them. And this is actually true amongst some people even today. A lot of people, I know when I was younger, when we looked at horses, a lot of people really favored horses that had solid coloring. I don't know why, but there you have it. But in this time, they were significantly more valuable. So Jacob actually asked for the least of the least. And furthermore, he gives them a solid way. He says, listen, I'm going to take these, you take those. And that way, if you look at what I end up taking from you, you will know immediately if I have wronged you. You will know immediately if I have stolen from you. So Laban, in his already typical fashion, goes into his flock and removes all of the male livestock with spots and markings. Why would he do that? Because it says he gives them to his sons, which is not Jacob, which is who it was promised to. So why would he do that?
You can't have children if you don't have others.
Well, let's think about animal husbandry. I'm sure that this isn't anyone's area of expertise in here, but it's pretty simple, right? How do you get livestock with more markings?
You breed with livestock more.
That's right. So by removing all the male livestock with markings, Laban has essentially minimized the amount of new livestock that will be created with those markings. Does that make sense? So at this point, go ahead.
Why he moved him 3 days away.
That's right. Because nobody wants the speckled goat getting out of the fence and making babies anyways. So Laban hasn't just refused Jacob some form of the pay. He didn't just refuse the male of his life. He's actively seeking to do wrong to Jacob in the future at this point. Because he's actively trying to keep Jacob's wages small. And in the hopes of removing the male speckled livestock, that means the only male livestock that can breed are solid coloring, which means his livestock grows. So while Jacob has, at least in this instance, carried himself very honorably and honestly, Laban carries on in his typical me-first fashion. In verse 37, that's where we're at, it says, Then Jacob took fresh sticks of poplar and almond and plane trees and peeled white streaks in them, exposing the white of the sticks. He set the sticks that he had peeled in front of the flocks in the troughs, that is, the watering places where the flocks came to drink. And since they bred when they came to drink, the flocks bred in front of the sticks. And so the flocks brought forth striped, speckled, and spotted. And Jacob separated the lambs and set the face of the flocks towards the striped, and all the black in the flock of Laban. He put his own droves apart and did not put them with Laban's flock. Whenever the stronger of the flock were breeding, Jacob would lay the sticks in the troughs before the eyes of the flock, that they may breed among the sticks. But for the feebler of the flock, he would not lay them there. So the feebler would be Laban's and the stronger Jacob's. Thus the man increased greatly and had large flocks, female servants and male servants, and camels and donkeys. So Jacob effectively turns this against Laban. If you had a hard time understanding the picture that was just painted for us, it's pretty simple. At some point, Jacob must have received some instruction. I would argue some divine instruction on this. Does it say that? No, but I can tell you that putting a striped stick in front of a livestock when it breeds should not logically produce a striped livestock, okay? So my argument is this must have been some instruction from God in order to bless Jacob, even though his uncle is trying to wrong him and take away from him. And so essentially the livestock come to the watering hole. As the female would drink, the males would, breed, And so there, Jacob could actually decide which livestock looked like ones that he'd want. So he would lay sticks in front of the strongest livestock to make their young striped or speckled, and the weaker of the livestock, he wouldn't put sticks in front of. Basically, the idea is over a few generations, Laban has only the weakest of livestock because the strongest of them have all been striped and speckled. And so, in a way, God actually turns this against Laban. Why? So, again, we come back to an original thought. Why would God do this?
Could argue that he was doing it to punish Laban. Whether that's a good excuse or not, I don't know. But it was part of his plan to make sure that.
It definitely punishes him. I think I would argue that that's a peripheral benefit.
I believe that. But he had a plan for Jacob to do well. That's
Right there.
God.
Yeah. So God promises to bless him with abundance, right? Or to make him wealthy. So, he has to come up with a way for Jacob to gain this livestock, which is what a lot of this plan ends up being. But also blesses Jacob further by giving him a plan to have the strongest livestock. And I think that's when I say there's a peripheral. I don't think that the whole plan was put there to punish his uncle Laban, but I think that it's very clear that there's at least some of that in there, because that's why God decides, well, your flock can now be weaker while I make Jacob stronger. There's no reason to do that other than to punish him. Okay, so we'll move on. We're almost done here, guys. Thus the man increased greatly and had large flocks, female servants and male servants, and camels and donkeys. So, we go throughout the whole chapter of here. I want to ask a very simple and complex question at times. Was Jacob faithful and trusting throughout this chapter?
Say it again.
Was Jacob faithful? Was he righteous and trusting throughout this chapter? Did he, throughout this entire chapter, did he always do what was right in the eyes of God?
Oh, no.
Can you point at least one thing out?
Straight mistakes right in front of the breeding creatures.
I don't know that he did anything wrong there, because like I said, I would argue that that plan had to have come from God in order for it to have worked. I would point out that he slept with women who weren't married to him.
Yeah, that's true. All that stuff is still going on.
Yeah.
But I think you were referring to the shepherding.
No, I mean the chapter as a whole.
As a whole, yeah.
Because,
yeah.
okay, so the point I want to make is Jacob is because this is not a linear story. We're given this in two sections, the story of his home life and then the story of his work life. But most likely, understand I wasn't there, but most likely these two segments of chapter 30 are actually going on at the same time. Okay? Do you guys follow what I mean by that? Okay, so that means that God is blessing Jacob even though Jacob is in the midst of adultery. My point is this. God will choose to bless who he chooses to bless. It is not our place to decide whether they're worthy of those blessings. It's not our place to decide why certain people have blessings. It's not our place to demand blessings from others as Rachel did. And you notice Rachel didn't get her just rewards from God until after everyone else had been born. I don't think that's a coincidence either. So often we can look at others who seem to be getting, and we get into this woe is me mentality. And we feel sorry for ourselves, and we feel jealous, and it's understandable when you're wishing or hoping for a blessing and it doesn't come, and you see other people getting the very thing that you're hoping for, and it's understandable that that hurts. But we have to be very cautious of charging God with wrongdoing. And I say that because it's so easy to fall into. It's so easy to fall into the trappings of Job and say, well, God, you're God, so I can't do this, but if I could confront you, you'd be giving me an answer right now. God blesses us when he chooses to bless us. And God will bless others when he chooses to bless others. There is nothing we can do to change it. The only thing we can do is to continue trusting in God, to continue praying to God, to continue beseeching God. Don't stop praying for those blessings. If that's what's on your heart, make sure God knows that it's still on your heart. But be careful not to fault others for getting the blessings you want to have. God will bless you in his time according to his plan. Is there any last comments, questions, or remarks? Jerry, you got something to say tonight? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Excellent. You did a better job than I did of recapping. You should be up here. I'll work on it. I'll get you up here eventually, Jerry. All right, let's go to God in prayer. Dear Heavenly Father, we give you thanks for this evening and this opportunity to stand before you, to come to you with our hearts open and our minds sated. We ask that you help us to remember this lesson from tonight. We ask that you help us to implement that into our lives, that we can be those patient people, those trusting, faithful servants who know that we will get the blessings you have planned for us in the time that you have planned them. Help us to understand that it is not our place to rush what is planned. I pray that you watch over each person here tonight, those that are listening, that you bless them in their lives with abundance and goodwill towards others. That you bless them with a plethora of opportunities in their lives to reach others, to instruct others as to your will and to your ways, and that they are afforded all the opportunities to disciple others, to teach them who your Son was and who he is, what he means to us. Pray that you equip us, that you protect us, and that you guide us. I pray these things in the name of your Son, Jesus, our Christ, Lord and Savior. Amen.